In all my projects, I begin with the medium. In other words, I'm really interested in photographic forms and media. And those are the starting points for me. I take that once I find something that I'm interested in, and then I work backwards. I'm like, well, how can I use this to more adequately tell or engage with or communicate or reveal a certain subject? And of course, since my work has this close relationship to photojournalism, to reportage and to documentary forms, I'm very interested in trying to engage with world affair events, unfolding with history as it unfolds. The Enclave is the title of the video installation, which is a 6-screen, double-sided screen, very immersive, very spatial and quite visceral video installation made in Democratic Republic of Congo in 2012-2013 and shot on 16mm infrared film. And the photographs, which are also shot with that infrared film but using medium format and large format cameras, those still photographs I've titled Infra. According to one statistic, 5.4 million people had died of war-related causes in Congo since 1998. Yet we don't really hear that much about that extraordinarily large loss of life, this huge humanitarian disaster. So this is a failure of documentary photography, and I was interested in exploring that failure. There's a lot of human displacement, particularly huge numbers, perhaps millions of people were on the move, certainly hundreds of thousands, and living in tents and fleeing their homes for safer places. Over the process of five years working there and immersing myself in those narratives and meeting numerous warlords and armed groups and understanding bit by bit the conflict for myself, I realized that is simply because it's complicated. You have more than 50 armed groups in Eastern DRC, and none of them are good guys. Corruption is entrenched and has been for generations since Mobutu. And so there really isn't really any easy answers or any simple sound bites. So it's a difficult one to represent. In 2009, Kodak announced the discontinuation of Kodak Aero Chrome, which is quite an early stock that they had developed in World War II in collaboration with the US military. And the specific purpose, the function of the film at that stage was for camouflage detection. So you have to understand that the enemy camouflage is green, and the foliage of most landscapes is also green, therefore hard to see, right? So they realized if they could image the landscape in a different way, they may be able to locate those camouflage installations much easier. And of course, the way they did that was by imaging infrared light. Now, infrared is invisible to the human eye. It's not pink, it's not red. Those are arbitrary representations. They're ways of allowing us to imagine what infrared looks like. And those were just invented arbitrarily by Kodak's engineers. Those images are showing us an invisible image. So we're looking at invisible spectrum of light, a representation of it. And that really was the hook for me. I was very interested in that because I had read around the subject of the sublime in art history. And the sublime is about making visible what exists outside of language. And this, I think, is also what contemporary art can do as well when it's effective, is to refer to and to indicate, to point at and to make visible things that we have a hard time articulating normally. After I got to Eastern Congo, I realized there were layers of meaning that overlapped. For example, a lot of the conflict there is not getting the attention it deserved. So on some level it was unseen, it was overlooked. And so to engage with it, to try to represent it with a film that actually registers the invisible, is a way to sort of, even only metaphorically, to sort of smash these ideas together about visibility and perception. With the large format camera, I was mapping the very beautiful sites of human rights violations and sometimes massacres. And that was, of course, there's a great irony, a tension between the subject that underwrites those places and the aesthetic beauty of those places. Building relationships with the armed groups took a long time, and we had to win their trust in many occasions. Certain armed groups are much more media savvy and they're much more willing to play ball with photographers and journalists, but others are much more wary and suspicious. there's always a sort of confrontation, not always, but often, amongst the Congolese armed groups and rebels, and the soldiers of the National Army. It's like a kind of strange face-off with the camera. Not only does it reveal how they regard themselves as sort of a contradiction between wanting to pose and wanting not to be photographed, but also this face-off with the photographer, and thereby, of course, the viewer. And I think that aspect of the project is really the aspect that speaks strongest to the colonial gaze and to this sort of this indictment by the Congolese subject and by the Congolese rebel of the viewer. And I find those portraits the strongest, in fact, which almost defy the camera's lens. I felt that spoke very strongly to my own subjectivity as a white man working in Eastern Congo, documenting these atrocities. The effects of mapping the valleys and the mountains of Eastern Congo with this particular film, you could say it's a very expressive way of making a landscape photograph, but it often has anthropomorphic qualities. Sometimes it has an unreal, like a surreal quality. The pinks, sometimes they're like almost a neon candy pink. Extraordinary, dreamlike, chimerical associations, which are very powerful. It's a very aggressive medium, so it works very well on computer screens, for example. It's got color, you know, so it's got teeth. So it's able to jump out and communicate something, which is really one of the reasons why I tried to use this particular palette in Eastern Congo to try to amplify and communicate those narratives. A good photograph will make you reflect. It's not a visceral experience like a video installation can be. And so in my work, when I have an exhibition involving both video installation and framed photographs hanging on the wall, I find often that they have an almost counteractive effect upon each other. So they offer the viewer two ways of accessing the subject. One is through the mind and the other is through the heart. So this fella here is the camera that I used to produce my latest body of work, titled Incoming, and the related series of photographs which I call the heat maps. Challenging the rules of photojournalism was definitely a mission in my earlier work in Congo. It's less so in the new work. The new work about the refugee crisis. They're more concerned with the erosion of human rights in modern Western societies and the implications of that, and finding a way of visualizing that and confronting the viewer with the ways in which our governments and our societies represent and therefore regard the refugee. The point of the work is to try to make people think about the ways in which our governments are dealing with the refugee crisis, and Europe's response is woefully inadequate compared to how we responded to the extraordinary wave of human displacement that happened after World War II. This is a video camera, and those heat maps are still photographs, but they're made with a video camera. So I think it made more sense to start to explore the visual language as video rather than as photography. So this camera can image the human body from 30.3 kilometers, or that's about 18 miles. And it's always controlled remotely through laptops, sometimes very far from the actual camera. It's a thermographic camera. It can work day or night, and it sees heat. It's thermal. And it does that by registering medium wave infrared. So it goes really quite far down the infrared spectrum. It was designed for battlefield situational awareness, for long range border enforcement, to detect and track insurgents, targeting and killing the enemy, and for search and rescue. So in some respects, you could regard this camera as one aspect of the military humanitarian complex that is a part of the EU's response to the mass migration crisis that confronts us in modern times. And back at the time when I was trying to buy the camera and trying to work it out and coming up with the ideas, brainstorming, that was 2014. And that was the first year in which the mass migration, the refugee crisis as it's known, really kicked off exponentially. So we had that year alone more than 1 million souls landed on European shores by sea. So these are dispossessed, stateless people, refugees, putting their lives in the hands of human traffickers, many of whom are really quite unscrupulous, evil people, to try to get to a safer place. That is Europe. So they're trying to reach safety in Europe and to seek asylum here. And so it didn't take take long actually for me to make the connection between the camera and the crisis as a very, very interesting way of thinking through the ways in which our governments and therefore our societies actually represent the refugee, and a way of meditating on that and confronting the viewer with that reality. I've got a military tool and I'm trying to work against it. So I'm rubbing it against the grain. I'm trying to find a way to use it against itself in a very simple way in order to communicate the struggle of the refugee, their journeys and the conditions in which they find themselves in a more powerful way. It's not really designed for storytelling or for aesthetic purposes. So it's quite by accident actually that we found that it produces a very beautiful image, aesthetically speaking. The tonality of the heat signature that it produces, which shows relative temperature difference within a given scene. There's a real beauty to that, the sort of jagged edges, the crispiness, but also the blown out, distorted highlights where things are too hot or too cold to represent. All of that chaos, all of that sort of adds up to something we found extremely powerful aesthetically speaking, particularly in figuring the human body. Obviously, you know, because we produce heat, our cells, they have combustion going on inside, and so the camera can actually read and portray all of aspects, very intimate aspects of our biological organisms, such as our breath, our blood circulation, you know, even the patterns in which our veins and arteries beneath our skin, how they are structured, but also like our sweat. These are all very intimate aspects of ourselves that we often can't see with a normal camera or with the human eye. So, having worked in and around refugees for the last 3 years to make this work, you realize how difficult their struggle is, but also how exposed they are to the elements, and how the human body, how vulnerable it is, particularly to cold and to hypothermia, and also to heat. And then they get to Europe and they often live for months or years in tents, so it's very difficult to survive physically. And I feel that the way we've chosen to represent the refugees, it foregrounds that mortality, that bodily vulnerability, the physical vulnerability of these people. One event in particular, which shows the potential of the camera to convey these narratives, is, to our horror, we watched a boat of more than 300 people breaking apart in the sea between Turkey and Lesbos. And with this camera we could zoom right in. It was about maybe 10 or more kilometers distance, and so we could see how many people were on the boat, and they very quickly were carried away. The boat took a while to sink, but then after a while it was all gone, and people were being carried by the tide, holding onto each other, and they were being separated. And it took a long time. The sea was very rough, and they were brought into the port of Molyvos, and by that stage night had fallen, and it was a scene from hell.
I can hardly get in the air.
The volunteers and the emergency workers were literally using their hands to try to get life-giving warmth back into their bodies, and you could see the thermal handprints on the blankets, and you could literally see how cold these people were. The camera shows their like pallid marble color versus the warm black hands of the volunteers. So this is I guess a way that the camera is able to communicate that particular narrative in a more effective way than a normal video camera can. But the camera also anonymizes the subject, and I think privacy is a really key aspect of this work. You can't recognize who that person is, and I think that's very important when representing refugees who don't want to be identified for reasons of their own. So this is a narrative dilemma. Do we simply not tell these stories because we don't want those people to be identified, and they don't want to be identified? Or do we tell the story in a way in which they cannot be identified? And that's what I've tried to do, to address and attempt to resolve that narrative dilemma in this way. My opinion is that beauty is the sharpest tool in the box. I feel that aesthetics can be understood to be the opposite of anesthetic, In other words, it can be used to awaken the senses rather than put you to sleep. And so we have a moral imperative as storytellers and as photographers to more adequately communicate these difficult narratives to people, so people are more aware. The change that comes from art is so lacking concreteness, it's so abstract, you know. Whereas if you're an activist or a human rights lawyer who works on the refugees' asylum cases, you change their lives concretely. You actually save their lives in some cases, or you allow them to live in that country, and that must be a wonderful feeling. It's very rare as a photographer or an artist that you get that kind of concrete satisfaction of having changed somebody's life. But I believe there's a different, different layers of change, obviously. I mean, there are subtle shifts in, almost imperceptible shifts in consciousness that happen through art and through writing, through literature, and that's a different kind of change, you know.